Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Leadership Podcast, where we explore the systems, science, and leadership shaping global climate action. Today's episode takes us inside the scientific foundation that underpins climate policy worldwide. At the center of this process is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which synthesizes global research into assessments that guide governments, industries, and financial systems. Today, I'm joined by Professor Paulo Ceppi from Imperial College London, a lead author for Working Group 1 in the upcoming AR7 assessment cycle. With deep expertise in climate dynamics and feedbacks, he offers a rare, behind-the-scenes view into how climate science is built, debated, and translated into global decisions. Thank you, Professor, for giving us your time today.
Pleasure.
And before we begin our conversation, can you please share a bit about your journey so far?
Sure. So I guess I've been at Imperial since 2018 as an academic. And prior to that, I followed the usual academic pathway, which is, so you study, in my case, I studied earth sciences, and then you go on to research by doing a PhD. So I did a PhD from 2010 to 2015 at the University of Washington in Seattle in the US in atmospheric sciences, and then moved to the UK for first a temporary position and then the current permanent position at Imperial.
Right. Perfect. It's great to have you today. And let's start our conversation. So could you walk us through how the IPCC assessment process works behind the scene from author selection to final report?
Sure. So it's a long process that takes many years. So for each assessment report, there's a cycle of about 6-7 years in between assessment reports. And it starts with, I guess the first step is a scoping meeting where the member states agree on the outline and main contents of the report. And once that is decided, then there's an author selection process for the report, which is based on government nominations. So each member state, and by member state it means virtually every country in the world, so all countries that are part of the UN, they can nominate experts from their own countries to contribute to the report. And then the final selection is done by the IPCC Bureau. And what they do is they try and, of course, they look, they pay attention to the expertise of the author teams, because we need to have, we need to cover, all the areas of expertise required for the report. But also they try and balance things, so between the global south and the developed countries, between genders, also career stages. And in particular for AR7, I know the IPCC are very proud that they have a very balanced pool of authors. For example, it's, I think, roughly 50-50 between men and women and between global south and global north, for lack of a better word. So yes, so that's the overall process.
Okay. So like the first step, which is the goal setting. So do we get something from AR6 as we move forward, or it's totally new every time we set up this thing?
I would say, I don't think, obviously we avoid reinventing the wheel, right, for every cycle, and there's a lot of expertise that's been accumulated across the cycles of IPCC assessment. So the whole process is quite tried and tested, but nonetheless, The exact outline of the report does vary from cycle to cycle, also to try and tailor it to the needs of governments and to the evolution of science. I think we'll come back to that maybe later in this podcast. But so for example, the AR7 outline, at least for the Working Group 1 report, which I'm involved in, does differ from AR6. Some chapters don't overlap with chapters of the previous report. So, which is a challenge because then, we, the scientists, need to think about the structure, how to best, convey the information, etc.
Okay, understood. So, as a lead author for Working Group 1, what does your role involve in practice, and how do you collaborate across such a large scientific global network?
Yeah, so I guess our role is, so we, the lead authors, write the report, really. And so we, in particular, what we do for the report is we perform an assessment, right? So we have to, I guess the IPCC assessment, as the name says, it's an assessment that makes it different from a review paper, in that we have to not just review the existing literature and evidence and so on, but we also have to provide expert assessments of how we interpret the findings. So for example, I'll try and give you an example to make this less abstract. We're seeing that the planet is warming, global temperature is rising, and we're asking ourselves, okay, how unprecedented are the changes that we're observing now? So, for example, when was the last time we had a similarly high temperature, in the global average? Mm-hmm. And that's not a simple black and white question because when you go further back in time, the evidence is, thinner or less clear because you have to look at indirect evidence of past temperatures. Mm-hmm. And so we will say, it's the warmest it's been in X million years with a certain confidence level. And that's the assessment, right? Giving a likelihood and a confidence to the statements we're making. And similarly for many other assessments of past and future changes. So that's really our role. And maybe just to add one more thing to this question, as lead authors, we also have to communicate with the community, right? Because we are synthesizing information that's been produced by the whole scientific and even non-scientific community. We have to look at local knowledge, indigenous knowledge is also part of the lines of evidence we use for the report. So our role is then to communicate with all these providers of information, if you like, and be aware of what information is available.
Okay. Professor, I was thinking you are a lead author. How many lead authors are there in this one system?
So so there's the 3 working groups, right? Working groups 1, 2, and 3, each of which produce a report. Working group 1 is on physical climate. We have 10 chapters, and per chapter there's about 20 lead authors, give or take. Mm-hmm. And actually 3 of these lead authors are so-called coordinating lead authors, so they have the kind of overall responsibility and oversight of the work across the chapter, so they have a high responsibility. Mm-hmm. I'm a simple lead author, if that makes sense, but we still all work together on writing the report and also collaborate across chapters.
Okay, and sorry, how do you get selected as a lead author?
Yeah, so there's the government nomination step, and actually prior to government nomination, the governments issue calls to the community, and so people can self-nominate. So they submit their paperwork to the governments, and then the IPCC point of contact in government will then select from these self-nominations to pass these on to the IPCC Bureau, who then will make the final selection. And again, based on these criteria I mentioned earlier of expertise, career stage, balance in terms of gender, nationality, and so on.
Okay, understood. So the IPCC is known for producing consensus science. How do you reconcile different scientific perspectives while maintaining a rigor and credibility?
Yes, of course, that's always the challenge. And I think there's several components to this. So first of all, the chapter teams are designed to be diverse, as mentioned before. so that hopefully avoids biases related to, for example, a Western-centric perspective, to give an example, and also ensures better geographical coverage, which is especially important for chapters dealing with regional climate. That's one thing. I think the other thing is the review process is central to the rigor and credibility of the process. So as part of the IPCC cycle, once the teams have been formed, there's several stages of review. So the author teams will write a zero-order draft, a first-order draft, and a second-order draft. And each of these will be reviewed by different groups of people, including initially just experts. And for the second-order draft, there's also experts plus government reviews. So government representatives will also review the drafts. And so this aims to ensure that the science is objectively represented, that there are no gaps, no biases. And ultimately, the final step is the approval of the report at the plenary meeting at the very end of the cycle, which means that ultimately the governments endorse the contents of the report. So all of this aims to make it as rigorous as possible.
Right. Professor, I was thinking like all the scientists and everyone working gives a lot of time and effort. So is this monetarily supported by the IPCC, or it's on personal learning curve? Like how does this work?
So we're not paid for this work. So we do it in our own time, essentially. We are reimbursed for our expenses. So we have, for example, 4 lead author meetings over the course of the IPCC process that we have to travel to in person. And of course, there's expenses from travel, accommodation, and so on. So all of that is reimbursed either by the state, that the scientists are representing, or by the IPCC itself. But there's we're not making a profit, if you like, on our involvement.
Right, understood. So climate science involves significant uncertainty. How does the IPCC communicate uncertainty in a way that is both scientifically accurate and useful for decision making?
Good question. I think that's one of the main challenges we face as scientists, in writing these reports. I think the difficulty is that uncertainty is hard to convey and to understand, especially for non-scientific audiences. But I think the main way we do this is, maybe there's a few ways, but one way is the IPCC has a calibrated vocabulary to convey uncertainty. So there are keywords that we have to use in the report to convey different levels of confidence or uncertainty. Words like likely, very likely, exceptionally unlikely, etc., have specific meanings, which is explained somewhere in the reports as well. So, for example, likely means 2/3 probability of something being true. Now, of course, the danger is that especially untrained or non-expert audiences may understand different things by the word likely, right? So I say likely to you, I mean 2/3 chance, but someone might think, oh, this is almost certain, right? So that, I think that is a real challenge. But to complement the key words that I was describing, there's also, I think we can also use things like visual representation. So we have figures in the reports that can also convey levels of certainty or uncertainty. For example, if we show projections of certain things, we can use different shadings to show, the different levels of likelihood associated with different outcomes. But it is an ongoing challenge for the authors of the report.
Right. Professor, I was thinking these reports are still very science-driven and scientifically worded. As a layman, I don't think it's easy for a layman to understand. So do you think they should also come up with a layman-oriented thing so that people also understand?
I think I agree with you, yes. I think there's several target audiences, right? And that's the challenge with these reports. You can't please everyone, right? Because some of the target is scientists, and then there's also government representatives, some of whom are well trained in science, some less so. politicians, but there's also the private sector and even the wider public. And each of these target audiences has different needs and understands different languages. So it's hard to reconcile all these different needs. But nonetheless, yes, I think there is room for a sort of easier access summary of the findings. For AR6, there was an initiative that came after the report was published. It wasn't part of the official IPCC cycle, but I think it was called the IPCC for All or something, the Summary for All it was called, sorry, which was kind of a summary of the summary. So there's a summary for policymakers which summarizes the main takeaways. And then the Summary for All was, a summary that was pitched more easily with illustrations and so on. And there's been discussions on whether to or how to include such summaries as part of the ongoing cycle. The difficulty is that everything is subject to member state approval. So we cannot just say, hey, let's have this extra bit in the report. It's not as simple as that. The IPCC is a very slow-moving machine because of the involvement of the member states.
Right. Okay. So reflecting on the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, what were the most important scientific shifts that emerged, and how did they influence global climate discussions?
I think there's been a general trend, and not just for the AR6, but even looking further back in time, there's been a general trend over the history of the IPCC, right, which started in the early 90s up to present. And at the beginning, it was all about, okay, is climate change actually happening in the first place? And if so, what role are humans playing?
Yes.
And we've shifted away from that because we've reached levels where we can say with almost perfect certainty now, yes, the climate is changing. Yes, humans are driving almost all of it. So we've shifted away from those questions more to other questions like, okay, so how much of the changes we're observing are actually due to humans? Also at the level of specific weather events, and that's particularly important for extreme weather events like extreme heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, droughts, and so on. So there's a whole field called extreme weather attribution, which became much more prominent as part of the Sixth Assessment Report, the AR6. I think that was one of the innovations, not complete innovation, but a shift towards that field.
Right.
Another shift, I think, was, so in the language used to qualify human influence, you may remember that the AR6 said human influence was unequivocal, which is a word very rarely used in the IPCC because we always deal with confidence levels. So we'll say things like very likely, extremely likely, but unequivocal means essentially 100% confidence or as close as you can get to that. So I think, we reached that level. You cannot go further than that. So that's why I think we're shifting more towards these other questions of attribution of specific events.
Okay.
And maybe one more thing to say on the shift as well in topics is also with AR6, there was a shift towards understanding policy targets of global warming, think 1.5 and 2 degrees. So what are the impacts of these warming levels, but also what are the carbon budgets associated with these warming levels? How do we deal with overshoots? What happens in overshoot scenarios where you temporarily get over and then back to 1.5 or 2? I think these are the main things I can think of.
Right. So, Professor, like it said that IPCC provides the scientific evidence. It is not for policy making. It's just to support a point of view or the argument that Earth is heating and we have extreme weather events, right? How have you seen from your experience how policymakers react to such evidence?
I think, at least on the government side, so I'm less familiar with the private sector, but on the government side, most governments take the IPCC process and the reports very seriously. And the reports really have shaped climate policy. I mean, 1.5 is a really good example. The 1.5 degree limit was informed by findings that were part of the IPCC cycle, which helped decide, okay, what are the climate risks associated with different levels of global warming. And then once 1.5 and 2 degrees were chosen as policy targets, there was then a lot of policy that followed from that in terms of, okay, what are the emissions we can afford to cause, or in other words, what are the carbon budgets associated with these warming levels? And so, for example, the EU then came up with the net zero by 2050 policy, and not just the EU, but EU, UK, other countries. And the reason they did that is because of work that was conveyed in the IPCC reports, that if we want to stay below or as close to 1.5 as possible, we have to get down to net zero as soon as possible, ideally by mid-21st century. So I think, on the whole, the IPCC reports have had substantial impact.
Right. Okay. So as we move into AR7, what are the key areas where you expect the science to evolve, particularly in understanding risks, projections, and climate feedback?
I think this ties in with what I answered to the previous question on, the overall shift we've seen over the course of the IPCC lifetime, if you like. And so going into AR7, my sense is, also from what I can see, from the discussions and the meetings so far, there is an enhanced focus on extreme weather and climate events and their attribution to human factors. There's also, I think, an enhanced focus on tipping points, because as the planet continues to warm, we are increasingly likely to trigger these so-called tipping points, which are points where suddenly, beyond a certain threshold of temperature or CO2 concentration, you trigger rapid changes in the climate system that then have further consequences. So, for example, drastic changes in the circulation of the oceans, or very rapid melting of certain ice sheets that would cause rapid sea level rise. These are examples of tipping points, or rapid dieback of rainforests like the Amazon. So, for example, in AR7 Working Group 1, there's an entire chapter devoted to tipping points, irreversible climate change, and so on. I think, so yeah, this is one, not a complete innovation, but a greater focus part of the AR7 cycle. And then in terms of projections, one change, so for each IPCC assessment report, there's the evidence is supported by climate scenarios, which are simulated by climate models, that then see how the global climate would evolve under different emission scenarios. And the scenarios used for AR7 will not include the very highest emission scenarios that were used in AR6. So there will be less high emissions, if you like, or at least the most extreme high emissions cases won't be there. And there will be more focus on, I think, on overshoot scenarios, net zero scenarios, even if they might not be politically very feasible at the moment. But at least there's a need for scientific understanding of how things would unfold under such scenarios.
Right. I see. So there is often criticism that climate science can either be too conservative or too alarmist. How does the IPCC navigate this balance while maintaining trust?
I think that's where the role of scientists is really important, right? It's really essential that the report is written by scientists who have as objective a view as possible, as opposed to activists or interest groups. So, yes, so I think the scientists ensure, some scientists can also be activists, but when we write the report, we have to put really our scientific hat on and objectively evaluate the scientific evidence that's available. So I hope that ensures that we are objective. I think you could perhaps criticize the IPCC for being conservative in the sense that the exact wording of the report, particularly the summary for policymakers, has to be approved by governments who also kind of negotiate the wording. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the wording will be toned down because different governments have different interests. You can think, for example, of low-lying island nations who have a real interest in climate impacts being highlighted, and especially sea level rise and so on. So I think, while not perfect, the process is probably as good as it can be given the constraints of global geopolitics.
Right. Professor, I always think that scientists should be more of activists because they are having hard evidence, right? Science-backed evidence, rather than general activists who just make noise. What do you think of this thought process?
I think there's room for different levels of engagement, right? And also it depends on what individuals are more comfortable with. Some people are natural communicators to the broad public. Some people are more hardcore scientists and perhaps better at speaking to other scientists. Some people are good at political arguments, which is very different from science, right? One thing is having scientific evidence, another thing is making political statements that will convince people. So I think, we need a diversity of ways in which scientists can be involved. And some scientists will be comfortable being activists as well, and others will prefer keeping a scientist hat on. I think that's okay. One thing that's maybe important to say, since we're talking about the IPCC, is that all of us lead authors, when we speak to the media, to the public, we cannot speak on behalf of the IPCC, and that also ties in with the previous question, on maintaining trust. We cannot, say what the IPCC thinks. The IPCC does not think about politics. It provides policy-relevant recommendations or evidence. But so we can only speak in our own voice, as scientists. So that's one important thing, about the role. So yes, we can be activists, but that has to be somewhat separate from our involvement in the IPCC.
Okay, so IPCC does not want any liability from any of the words spoken by the scientists.
I think that's right, exactly, yes.
Okay, sure. So how do IPCC findings translate into real-world impact, whether in government policy, financial markets, or corporate strategy?
Sure. So again, I know a bit more about the government policy implications than the financial or corporate ones, but and I already touched on earlier on how the IPCC has shaped government policy, in particular around the 1.5 and 2 degree targets. Maybe another example has been, in terms of the idea of loss and damage, as it's called. So the fact that that different nations are being impacted differently by climate change, and in particular, not necessarily those nations that are, in fact, often those nations that are less responsible for historical emissions are those that are being hit hardest, right? Again, thinking of low-lying island nations. So as part of one of the recent COPs, COP27, this loss and damage fund was set up. And again, I think that was in large part informed by IPCC findings, in particular climate risks. I think climate risk is also relevant to the financial sector. I mean, one example I can think of is the whole insurance industry, right? We know that certain risks or certain regions are no longer insurable. And so that again shows how the private sector has registered this evidence, coming in large part from IPCC reports. And lastly, in terms of corporate strategies, I think, a lot of companies are or have adopted policies to reduce their emissions or even to aim for net zero. And we know that there's always the risk of greenwashing, right, of sort of empty words. And I think for these strategies to be credible, they need to be backed by IPCC science. So I think, IPCC science provides a bit of a seal of quality, I would say, to the strategies that are adopted by the corporate sector.
Sure. So given the urgency of climate action, do you think the pace of scientific assessment is aligned with the speed at which decisions need to be made?
That's a tricky one, because as we've seen, the IPCC cycle is slow and long, right? It takes years for each report to be prepared and reviewed and approved. And so that means that whenever the IPCC reports come out, they're by nature, they're already a year or two or three behind the latest evidence. And that's unavoidable. I think, there's trade-offs. We could have a faster process, but then that would be at the expense of the credibility and engagement. So I think the process is probably as best as it can be. Nonetheless, since you're asking about the urgency of climate action, really, I think all the information we need to back up the need for urgent action is already there, right? So we don't need a new, as much as I like, being involved in the IPCC and I still think it's important, I think we're beyond the point where we need evidence to tell us that,
Yes.
action is needed now. So from that point of view, hopefully we're at the point where, we have the evidence we need.
Yes, I think we do have the evidence, we have the science. We just need now more policies,
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, what I feel. Okay, what are some of the biggest misconceptions professionals have about the IPCC works and how its findings should be interpreted?
Okay, so maybe that question will be best asked to those end users of the report, if you like. But what I can say, as being on the side of the authors, we've already talked about the IPCC being policy relevant rather than policy prescriptive, right? So it's not our role to tell people what to do.
Right.
And that's possibly a misconception about how the IPCC works. Another potential misconception, I hope not, but it could be that we are representing certain interest groups, which is by and large not the case. Most of us are academics. We just do research. We're not being paid extra for being on the IPCC. So, and in fact, it's a lot of extra work for us. I mean, it's a huge amount of work being on this report. It's a real challenge because it adds on to the usual workload we have, for example, at universities with teaching, research, and so on.
Yeah.
So if anything, it's a burden. I mean, we do it because we think the process is important and because we know it's well recognized. So that might be a misconception in the public that they think, yes, we're just being paid a fortune to write this nice report, and when it's quite the opposite, actually.
True, right. Okay, so Professor, finally, for leaders in policy, finance, and industry, what is the most important takeaway from the IPCC process that they should pay attention to today?
I think some of the key takeaways, again, have already been published in previous reports about unequivocal human influence on climate. I think for the new report, it's still too early to say. So for the AR7, it's still too early to say what the key takeaways will be because the report is being written. So we're now in the process of writing the first order draft. So we're still even deciding, okay, what are the key messages going to be? But I can give you my sense of where things are heading, and kind of consistent with what I mentioned earlier. I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on extreme weather and climate, and how much of that can be explained by or attributed to human influences, and also the risks of drastic climate change like tipping points. I think maybe ask me again in a year, and I might have some updates on what the newest takeaways are for the AR7.
Right. So thank you, Professor, for offering such a clear and insightful look into how global climate science is built and communicated. Today's conversation highlights that climate leadership begins with understanding the scientific foundation behind every major decision. The work of the IPCC represents one of the most important global collaboration, bringing together thousands of scientists to inform how we respond to climate change. As the AR7 cycle progresses, its insight will shape policy, finance, and strategy across the world. For leaders across sectors, engaging with this science is no longer optional, it is essential. To our listeners, thank you for joining the Climate Leadership Podcast. Until next time, take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.